Academic freedom's obviously, as Pauline indicated, I mean, there's so many different angles that you could come at this at, and so many different things that I could talk about this evening. And I don't want to sit here for 3 hours. It's going to be hard enough for me to shut up after half an hour. So if there is something that you're particularly interested in that I don't talk about, please, by all means, just feel free to bring it up in the discussion, and that will be a useful point to talk about it then. So when I first started thinking about writing this book, Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity, academic freedom was obviously something that I was interested in. It's something that I've been interested in for a long time, mainly because of a political interest in free speech. But it wasn't a kind of major issue like it is today. I mean, at the moment, it seems to me like every single day you turn on the news, you pick up a newspaper, and there's some new story about campus madness, and normally campus madness of the very censorious variety. So today, I don't know if anybody saw it, and I still can't quite work out whether it's satire or not, but a number of these stories now seem to have that sense to me where I have to read them 2 or 3 times before I can actually work out whether it's true or whether it's satire. So the one this morning was about King's College London, students there wanting the national anthem to be banned from graduation ceremonies because it's considered to be racist and promoting white nationalism. So there's a bit of a dispute going on. I think this is true as far as I can tell. It hasn't actually been banned, so I don't want to exaggerate it. But certainly there's been students petitioning for it to be banned from graduation ceremonies. Yesterday in the Sunday Times, there was an article about the extent of trigger warnings being used in UK higher education. And I think if I was sat here 2 years ago, trigger warnings were something that I don't think had even been heard of. And I think it's really interesting to see how we've almost taken on a new vocabulary in this country over the past couple of years with words like trigger warnings and microaggression and safe space kind of filtering out of higher education and entering the mainstream because of the popularity of these news stories in the press. So yesterday it was the extent of trigger warnings, which seems to me now to be pretty much every university, if not every course in every university, and not compulsory, but certainly they seem to be very, very extensive. The day before that, the discussion was about Bristol University having pulled from their student amateur dramatic society a production of Aida because of fears of cultural appropriation. And that's just 3 days, that's the last 3 days. So I think at the moment it seems like pretty much every day you get some of these news stories. Now, I think it's quite interesting to think about what do we make of all these news stories? Because on the one hand, my instinct is to want to say, bloody students, always banning everything, and to get cross with students for being so censorious. But at the same time, I'm quite conscious that there is a risk of using students as kind of pawns in a culture war, which I think is actually really unhelpful. And I think one question to ask ourselves is, why is the press, why is the mainstream media now so obsessed with what students are getting up to? And I think you can see it from the left perspective. I'm kind of use these terms very, very loosely, but the left are very interested in what students are doing, mainly because they are quite supportive of it and they're wanting to explore issues like cultural appropriation, for example, the way that race plays out on campus and issues around racism. And I think underpinning that, something that worries me a lot and something that I think would be quite useful for us to perhaps talk about afterwards, I think what's underpinning a lot of what's going on in universities nowadays, and coincidentally it's World Mental Health Day today, is this really increased perception of students as being very, very vulnerable nowadays in a way that they just weren't seen as being vulnerable in the past. It's almost as if just being a student at university today is enough to somehow give you this status as being uniquely fragile and uniquely at risk. So the university that I work at some of the time now, the University of Kent, their big thing for this week is the pets as therapy, and they're taking puppies onto campus. And, you know, again, it's hard in some ways to be really horrible about this, because the dog that does come on and sit outside the library, I've seen this and I've watched it, it is a lovely dog. I mean, it is very, very soft, and you can, I didn't actually do it, but you can watch students coming up and petting this dog. And, you know, you have to be particularly cynical to think this is a really horrible thing. The dog is obviously nice. The students are all right, I'm sure, if you get to talk to them about it, talk to them. But this underlying perception of students as being very, very vulnerable and needing therapy, not because of anything in particular, not because of any particular problems, but just because of the general status of being a student, I think is quite problematic. But I think there's a certain perception from the left that it's actually quite radical to see students as being vulnerable. And there's this perception that you can then tie that into issues around student debt, how difficult it is to get a job nowadays, crisis of accommodation, high cost of living, etc., etc. So this idea that students are vulnerable, that we need to have these things like trigger warnings, I think ties into a kind of left-wing, loosely narrative nowadays. At the same time, though, I think there's also a certain narrative that's emerging from the right, where you've got this vocabulary around social justice warriors and their kind of continued war against this notion of a kind of lefty social justice warrior. And the student censorship can be knocking censorious students, can be taken up by the right as a way of, like I say, it sounds a very grand way of putting it, kind of playing out a culture war against the left. And, you know, at risk of making students out to be vulnerable myself, I think the problem with this is that students become kind of pawns in this left-right culture war dynamic. And what I would like to do this evening, and what well, maybe with hindsight, it looks like I was trying to do it in the book, but I would be a bit dishonest to say I was trying to do that at the time, is just to take a step back, and rather than just seeing this as a kind of knockabout, oh, but you want to ban sombreros, oh, but you don't like Halloween costumes, oh, but you're racist, oh, but you don't understand intersectionality, kind of take a step back and think, where do these students come from? Because the fact is, these students didn't arrive on campus fully formed, censorious dictators. And I think it's really worth trying to tease out what is it that's going on in society, what's gone on in schools, what's going on elsewhere in the university that's producing these students the way they are. So that's kind of where I'd like to get up to at the end of this evening. But before we get there, I want to just say a few other things about the academic freedom in an age of conformity. So this came out in January. A couple of years ago, I came to Manchester. Simon kindly invited me after I wrote a book before that Pauline mentioned, Consuming Higher Education, Why Learning Can't Be Bought. And in that book, I explored the whole debate around tuition fees, which were only just beginning to be introduced at that time, and how that changed the way that students were perceived and the way students thought of themselves from student to consumer within the university, and how it privileged certain things like satisfaction, that students should have a satisfactory experience in the immediacy of being at university. That became kind of privileged above actually learning is difficult, and it's really involves you struggling, and it's can be very challenging, and the more you're challenged and the more you struggle, actually the more you learn, but it might not be directly equated to satisfaction in the short term. Pulled together things like looking at student satisfaction and also looking at the kind of instrumentalism that underpins a lot of higher education nowadays, the drive towards employability, how everything should be about skills rather than about knowledge. My basic argument in that book was that students are being constructed as consumers in a way, irrespective of whether or not they pay tuition fees. It's important to look at fees in the context of what students are being expected to do, if you like, when they're at university. And if university is being sold to students as something that is a satisfactory experience, it should be fun in the same way as you might expect a holiday camp to be fun. And it's also going to give you a piece of paper that you take 3 years later and kind of knock on the door of the local business and show them your certificate, and you then trade that in for a particular type of job with a particular salary, then hey, why shouldn't students pay for that? You know, if that's what you're getting, an investment with a particular return, if you're getting something that's going to be a satisfactory, make you happy, why shouldn't students pay for it? My argument, however, was really that university should be about more than that. It shouldn't be about satisfaction. It shouldn't be about employability. It should be about knowledge, conceived most broadly as a public good, if you like. And if university is about knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge, the transmission of knowledge, then actually it is fair to open up the discussion as to who should pay for it. So I was kind of repositioning the product of higher education, if you like, away from being a private good with individual returns towards suggesting actually it should be a public good with the pursuit of knowledge as its return. I kind of thought very, very naively that my conclusions then would go down well. With hindsight, this was very stupid of me. But I thought that the controversial bit of my book was, well, if it's just about satisfaction, then why shouldn't students pay for it themselves? But I thought where I got to at the end of the book, it should be a public good, it should be about knowledge, then we need to open up the debate again. To me, that seemed quite politically correct, dare I use that phrase, and very uncontroversial. Little did I know that was the most controversial part of the book, and I've got to say very honestly that really did take me by surprise. So whenever I talked about the book, whenever the book was reviewed, people would always come back at me and say, but whose knowledge? What concept of knowledge are you trying to project? Aren't you just defending an outdated idea of a white, patriarchal, Eurocentric curriculum? Aren't you just pushing your conception of what knowledge should be onto other people? And I was told that you can't argue, basically, for the importance of knowledge nowadays, and that there is no one concept of knowledge, even to talk about our body of knowledge being associated with any one discipline, in effect to evoke the concept of a canon, was very problematic. And like I say, I'm not lying when I said that really did take me by surprise, the extent to which, I mean, obviously I knew that debate was out there in theory, but the extent to which that was levelled as a criticism of what I was saying really did take me by surprise. It shouldn't have done. So I'm just going to look at my phone for a second, because I've got, somebody just sent me a tweet literally just before I came in, that I think really, if I can find it, really sums up how this debate is still very, very live at the moment. So this is a tweet from a teacher. Here, let me see. A tweet from a teacher, and it says, "A teacher's value is not in giving content. Talk to anyone inspired by a teacher. It's never," and then in quote marks, "they knew their stuff." And I suppose what I was arguing was, well, I beg to differ. You know, I think knowing their stuff is inspiring. And I think actually the value in a teacher is in the content and is in knowing your stuff. But that's just a regular kind of tweet. And the assumption, obviously I don't know the person who sent this, but I know the arguments well enough now to know that the assumption that's underpinning that is that actually the good teachers are the ones who care. And actually this does date back even to the very time when I was doing my PGCEs. This is going back to kind of 96, 97 now. I was told before I applied for my PGCE, this is at Warwick University, they will ask you why, for the interview, they will ask you why do you want to be a teacher? Whatever you do, say you love children. Because if you say you love your subject, you won't get a place. The kind of magic thing to say to get taken on to the PGCE is about how much you love children. So I said that and I got taken on to the PGCE. There you go. So this kind of degradation of knowledge, almost like a prejudice against teaching knowledge. And I think the key word for me in that tweet that I think is actually so important is content. That's what people don't like. They don't like the idea that teaching at any level is about content. On the one hand, content is seen as cheap nowadays. It's seen as easily Googleable, pub quiz answers, nuggets of information. And at lower levels of education, it's almost seen as then child abuse, seriously, kind of tantamount to child abuse. This idea that you would get children and you would then force feed them these nuggets of information. At levels of higher education, obviously this has become, the idea of content has become very much problematized around campaigns like why is my curriculum white, decolonize the curriculum. So obviously, sorry, I probably should have said this earlier, but obviously these debates are far, far more prevalent within the humanities and perhaps within social science. I suspect if you're doing maths or physics or chemistry, there's probably not so much pressure to decolonise. Although every time I say that, there's always somebody who says, oh, actually, you don't realise the full extent of it. And there is pressure to internationalise the chemistry curriculum as well. But anyway, that's something to talk about. So I was interested in academic freedom. I'd become aware of how problematic knowledge seemed to me. And it got me thinking about what does academic freedom really mean? Because I seem to have spent an awful lot of time kind of defending things that I really don't like Robert Thicke's blurred lines and page 3 pictures in the Sun newspaper. And you think, actually, you know, this is not really academic freedom. I still would defend those things and defend the right for those things to be on a university campus, but it's not really what academic freedom should be all about. I mean, you look back at historic campaigns around academic freedom and it wasn't all over the right of the student union to play a silly song like that. So I started kind of looking back into the history of academic freedom, where the concept originated from. You can go back a long, long way. You know, you can go back to ancient Greece to look at the concept. Obviously, go back to Socrates, perhaps the most famous proponent of the idea of intellectual freedom. And when universities were first established in this country and in Europe, they were intrinsically connected to the church. And there were a lot of battles that took place to both have universities as institutions freed from the connection to the state. So that was a battle between church and state that was being played out over the institution of the university. But then within that, further kind of late, more recently in time, there were battles then for individual academics to be freed from the strictures of the church, to be able to criticise the church. And it was really in that, going back to America, roughly, well, not even roughly, almost exactly 100 years ago, 1915, 1916, when academic freedom first became formalised as a concept. So there was a group of American professors that launched the American Association of University Professors, funnily enough, and they really began arguing for a formal concept of academic freedom to be recognised as a right of academics. And I think what's really interesting for me is that the thing that really pushed for this society to be formed and really brought the issue of academic freedom to the fore at that point 100 years ago was the influence of the church and was academics, science lecturers, academics, wanting to basically teach evolution and wanting to teach evolution against the will of the proprietors, the religious funders, benefactors who owned, in effect, the universities. And that battle between who gets to decide what's on the curriculum, is it the lecturers or is it the benefactors? And benefactors insisting on creationism and the Bible being taught, and academics arguing, no, actually we know best in this domain and we should be the ones who decide what the curriculum is, what content is taught. But I think this would be quite easy to see this battle in terms of personalities and in terms of the protagonists involved, the academics versus the benefactors, atheists versus religious people. But actually, I think it was far more fundamental than that, and it was about different conceptions of knowledge. And essentially, it was a battle between competing truth claims, and the idea kind of really, again, became formalized at that point, the kind of Enlightenment scientific method, if you like, that knowledge advances through challenging competing truth claims. And I think this is a really important, kind of quite difficult point to grasp. Well, for me, it was quite a difficult point to grasp, but it's a really important point as well to think about how our knowledge of the world has advanced over time, because to talk about competing truth claims requires a number of prior concepts to be in place, one of which, and I think this is really important, one of which is the whole concept of a truth claim, the idea that when you argue, the idea that knowledge should be intrinsically connected or have some connection to a concept of truth, that the pursuit of knowledge is in effect the pursuit of truth, that we're trying to get closer to our understanding. When we pursue knowledge, we're trying to get closer to our understanding of truth. And it was only really when I understood that it suddenly dawned on me really what was so controversial about knowledge nowadays, because if we have an understanding of knowledge as multiple truths, or if we talk about truth in inverted commas, or if we talk about truth as a personal construct, you have your truth and I have my truth, then nobody has a problem with knowledge. People only seem to have a problem with knowledge when you talk about truth with more of a capital T, or more of a my truth is better than your truth, because my truth is more objective, my proof disproves your truth. And it was that I think people have, that makes people have a problem with the concept of knowledge, arguing, I guess what I'm saying, is arguing that some knowledge is better than other knowledge, that not all knowledge is equal, that the creationist view of how the world came into existence isn't just an alternative explanation, isn't just one theory among many others, but has actually been proven to be wrong. And we can argue a superior truth based upon more scientific, more objective understandings. I think the other thing to say, though, is that this doesn't mean that once proven, truth is true for all time. And again, I think this is, for me, was a kind of difficult thing to grasp, that when you make truth claims, you're also asserting the contestability of what you're putting out there. And it's funny because I think in academia nowadays, it's actually two sides of the same coin, but we have both of these ideas being challenged. So on the one hand, it becomes very difficult to assert a truth because truth is relative, there is multiple truth. But on the other hand, it also becomes difficult to assert truth as contestable, because when we start talking about things like climate change, for example, if you argue that that is contestable, that then goes against the grain of a lot of work that's being done in that particular area. And so it seems to me that in academia at the moment, we have on the one hand this view that truth is multiple, that it's relative, that everybody has their own truth. But on the other hand, in some issues, we have this view that truth is there for all time and must be beyond debate and must be not contestable. What I'm arguing in this book, Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity, is that knowledge needs to have a connection to truth. Truth must always be contestable, but in order for knowledge to advance, we actually need people to be brave enough to make truth claims about the knowledge that they are putting forward, but also to be tolerant enough, I guess, to make these truth claims, but also to assert that these truth claims are contestable, to be open-minded enough to the contestability of, is that a word? To the contestability of the truth claims that they're making. So to allow for the challenge, but not to be afraid to actually assert something. And by assert something, I mean not afraid to assert that something is better, superior to something else. I've done loads, haven't I? Sorry, I knew I would just talk forever. So, right, let's bring this to a head. What were the implications then? So what I think then, and what I argue in this book, is that really it's since the end of the Second World War, the latter half of the last century, that these ideas about truth claims began to go seriously out of fashion. That the idea that you can assert something as being true, but this can still be contestable, really began to be very, very badly discredited. And you can understand why. The Enlightenment values became discredited through the experience and understanding of what had occurred with the Holocaust. The idea that knowledge might be rational, logical, the idea that taxonomy, that, a lot of these ideas that we'd held about knowledge that had their origins in an Enlightenment understanding of the world became very discredited. And within the humanities especially, they were replaced by a view of critical theory. And critical theory, I'm being really kind of quick and crude here, so I kind of have to apologise for this. But critical theory, I think, so I'm talking in particular here, I guess, about philosophers associated with the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, later looking at the influence of Foucault, of, first of all, structuralism, then post-structuralism, postmodernism. A lot of these ideas really pushed us away from any idea of objectivity in knowledge, and really promoted this idea that truth was multiple, that truth was relative. And in doing, they really, I think, overstated the importance of language in constructing the world. So this kind of, if you like, an old view of Marxism, and a very crude and old view of Marxism where the ideology, if you like, the superstructure in society was shaped by, and sorry, I do apologise, this is very, very crude, was kind of shaped by or had some relation to economic and material circumstances, was kind of turned completely on its head, so that it was argued that really there wasn't a kind of underlying material reality, that what we had was a world that was socially constructed entirely through images and languages, and that shaped people's perception of the world. So I told you I'm being very, very crude and very, very quick here. When students arrive on campus nowadays, and in fact what they're imbued with beforehand and kind of arrive like sponges ready to soak up this ideology, is that the world is constructed through images, that words can wound people, can inflict real psychic harm upon people, that words and images form and shape reality and the way that people really understand the world, that truth is multiple, that truth is relative, that there's no objective knowledge, that to assert an objective knowledge is to act in a way as a kind of imperialistic dictator, asserting that you know best. And I think all of these things sow the seeds then for so much of the student censorship that we see nowadays. So if you think of the concept of the trigger warning, you know, on the one hand, there's the student vulnerability that I mentioned earlier, but there's also the trigger warning, I think, encompasses student vulnerability on the one hand, but it also encompasses this idea that the knowledge I am about to share with you, the words I am about to use, the images I am about to show you, could inflict real psychic harm upon you. They could damage you. They could cause you psychological damage. So it's best we don't use them. The idea of the safe space stems from this student vulnerability on the one hand, but also this idea that there are dangerous words, ideas, and images out there that can really harm people on the other hand. You look at the concept of cultural appropriation, again, has its roots in this kind of identity politics that comes from within the academy, this idea that knowledge is entirely subjective and entirely dependent upon your own place within the world, the idea that the black man and the white woman cannot possibly see the world in the same way, but must have completely opposing views of the world, completely different views of the world. That paves the way for cultural appropriation. You know, so I think to end very, very briefly, yes, we should challenge students for being ridiculously censorious, but we shouldn't let academics off the hook. We also need to look at where do the ideas that students are spouting to justify their censorship come from? And I think those ideas are very, very firmly located within the academy, going back over decades. And we need to look what's been going on within humanities, within social science over the past 20, 30 years, as much as we start knocking these students, because it's only when we really do that, I think, that we can properly understand where these students are coming from. And if we knock students for being censorious without understanding where these ideas are coming from, we just pave the way for these ideas to be rehabilitated kind of every 5-6 years in some kind of cycle. We might win a few victories in the short term, but we won't win the war.